My name is Fiona McKinney, and welcome on this bank holiday Monday afternoon. So a little background, I'm a chartered counselling psychologist and integrative psychotherapist. I work in private practice and I do some supervision at a Southwest London treatment centre. I am going to look down at my notes because I have a mind that can't retain anything unless it has read it about a split second beforehand. So I trained at Roehampton and Clouds with Tim Layton and Derek Anderson, and at Metanoia in West London. What interested me about these trainings and what they had in common, or at least what resonated for me, was this contemporary leaning toward a much more interpersonal and relational approach to addiction treatment. So why female sex addiction? When I worked at a residential treatment centre in Surrey about 10-12 years ago, what I noticed at the time was that there were returning clients from relapses, and while the men were then being assessed for other comorbid conditions, often sex addiction, women were not, and they would slip through the cracks. And so that ignited an interest for me. But at this time, there was also an emergence of attachment and regulation theory that was beginning to reshape our clinical thinking, and particularly pulling us into thinking about addiction as an expression of an extreme emotional dysregulation and a derailment of a person's capacity to self-soothe and to auto-regulate their underlying internal and intolerable disturbance. So with ideas drawn from attachment theory, regulation theory, and applied to addiction, it does currently take us forward into a more relational psychology and an affect regulating theory, positioning affect regulation as a central therapeutic mechanism in terms of how we think about our work with addiction. Okay, so out of control sexual behavior has been recorded from as early as the 3rd century. But it was sexologist von Krafft-Ebing in the 19th century who offered a chilling observation of one of his patients, saying that if his condition affected him to such an extent that it permeates all his thoughts and feelings, allowing no other aims in life, tumultuously and in a rut-like fashion, demanding gratification and resolving itself into an impulsive, insatiable succession of sexual enjoyments. This pathological sexuality is a dreadful scourge for its victim, for he or she is in constant danger of violating the laws of the state, of morality, of losing his or her honor, freedom, and even life. Scary stuff. So over the last 2 decades, many authors and researchers have tried to establish a consensus of definition and etiology about excessive, out of control, and maladaptive sexual behaviors. And despite their efforts, these non-paraphilic appetitive sexual patterns still represent quite a conceptual quagmire. So do we think that excessive sexual behavior can be classified as a behavioral addiction, or indeed as a sexual addiction? Is sexual addiction actually an appropriate diagnostic term? Could it be that we're looking at classification of obsessive compulsive disorder or sexual compulsivity? Would these be in fact more applicable at times as a diagnosis? Or is it part of a mood disorder or even autism or schizophrenia? Certainly the literature in the field is fraught with these debates, which are complex and worthy of awareness and further thought. So while there is some validity in the arguments for these differential terms, there is also a need to acknowledge that although there is ambiguity and indecision about the advantages and disadvantages of these alternate conceptualizations, each label does carry with it implications for how the problem might be perceived and treated. One thing that is agreed is that the complexities inherent in seeking a definition for these out-of-control behaviors are at times more semantically confusing than diagnostically helpful. Okay. So what about sex addiction? I just want to say at this point that the term hypersexuality, which is probably the closest to what we would recognize as sex addiction, is an interchangeable term that I will use that way throughout the talk. I'm sure you're aware that hypersexuality was about to be included, they hoped, in the DSM-5, but it was thrown out because it had insufficient research to support their application. So what about sex addiction? Since Carnes first coined the term, it's grown both in popularity and in contention. And while there is still debate about the consensus about its defining characteristics, it's clearly argued to have a distinct set of criteria that is consistent and interchangeable with other addictive presentations, such as substance dependence, limerence, addiction, food, and pathological gambling. Most clinicians and researchers in the field agree that sexual disorders which do not fit some of these other DSM categories that we've mentioned can be best diagnosed using an adaptation of the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence. These are namely repeated and unsuccessful attempts to reduce or control inner stress and dysphoria, an increasing tolerance for the frequency of use, risk-taking despite negative and harmful consequences, whether they are physical, psychological, social, or financial, and symptoms of withdrawal following cessation of behavior. So Goodman states, sex addiction is thus not a bizarre aberration or a new fad, not even a unique disease. It is simply the addictive process being expressed through sex and compulsive dependence on some form of sexual behavior as a means of regulating one's feeling and sense of self. What seems to set sex addiction aside and differentiates this group from others is the high level of underlying distress, depression, anxiety, and often obsessive thinking, which are not often found in promiscuity alone. So what about women? Female sex addiction is a very narrow corridor of a very narrow corridor in the addiction field. And gender disparity about out-of-control behaviors has existed ad infinitum. These disparities exist at a social, cultural, and moral level and were evident in the 18th century, with Kant observing that women should avoid out-of-control behavior because their privileged place in society was ensured only if they adhered to a higher moral code than that of men. Covington suggests these gender disparities are still operating on a very deep level and within complex, culturally constructed, unconscious systems designed to contain both individual and societal anxiety in response to out-of-control behaviors amongst women. I think we particularly see human sexuality as being positioned at the nub of these complex intergender dynamics, and therefore as being one in which some of these nuanced tensions can actually be best observed. We know that historically excessive forms of sexual behavior for women was seen in a very negative light. Nymphomania. Hyposexuality was expected for women, but hypersexuality was not. Hypersexual men stereotypically were thought of as being male, as having some sort of prowess and desirable masculinity. Women with this behavior attracted quite a different sort of attention, including terms such as slut or whore. It seems there is still a very strong cultural message about the good woman being a passive woman and the loose, wanton, whorish woman being a bad woman. If we are to accept that our contemporary understanding of sex addiction and female hypersexuality might be tied up with our own deepest, most unconscious constructs laid down over time, it is understandable that some of us might struggle to see female sex addiction as anything more than a social construct, perhaps depicted by males, and as such representing a fundamental barrier to understanding female sexuality in the addiction field. With this in mind, we can begin to understand why there is a very particular need for self-knowledge and self-reflection, and a very particular need for a gender sensitivity in our work with female addicts that we may not have in a way that we could do. Okay. So, women have always been overlooked and underrepresented in addiction studies, not just in the area of sex addiction. The current research and clinical thinking in this area seems to be dominated and driven still by more patriarchal approaches to assessment, diagnosis, and treatment. While this rather male-dominated framework is useful, of course, and one in which we locate our clinical frame of reference and understanding, I believe it's not entirely adequate for women, and perhaps more so, fails to meet the very unique torture of the female addict. This, in combination with clinicians' personal values and biases towards female sex addiction, could be thought to create obstacles to knowledge about the condition, which hamper appropriate access to treatment and adequate diagnosis. Marnie Faree, who is one of the writers and researchers in the field, and there are very, very few, I think Marnie is part of a Christian movement and is very public about her own recovery. But she says there are crucial considerations here concerning female sex addiction that have very broad diagnostic implications. For many clinicians, and especially the public at large, a paradigm shift will be necessary that will require looking outside of the box of a male-dominated understanding about female sexual compulsivity. Okay. So I think female sex addiction resembles alcoholism in women 40 years ago, i.e. it's largely ignored. Carnes only incorporated female-orientated dimensions in his 25-item screening test as an afterthought, not my view, that's in the literature. And this was to reflect a consideration of gender difference. Goodman, in his Clinical Handbook of Sex Addiction, barely makes reference to female sex addiction at all. It takes Kafka in 2010 only one small paragraph to review the totality of the population-based empirical studies. He summarizes that in the 6 studies implementing a mixed gender sample, males outnumbered females, with women constituting between 6.8% and 43% of the sample, but more importantly, the mean was 18.6%, which is low. Although research is clearly scant, I'll just quickly review some of what I did find. The research, the literature search I did when I did my PhD dissertation, and I suppose one of the advantages was that it was very small. There wasn't a lot of research to do. So it really falls into 3 categories. The first is prevalence. So in the absence of any large-scale study, there is no access to accurate estimates of prevalence rates. It's just not possible to do. Some writers have speculated that for sexually addictive women, this could lie between 3 and 12%. Now this data is taken from the United States, which speaks volumes in itself. There is no data, except I think someone called Manpreet Dufar, who works with Mark Griffiths at Nottingham Trent, is generating some information about hypersexuality amongst women, but I think that's about it. Okay, so presentation. Some of the studies, let me start again. A search of the female sex addiction literature located 4 studies implementing a homogeneous female sample. Some researchers were primarily concerned with identifying characteristics of sex addiction amongst females by exploring clients' subjective experiences in qualitative studies. Faree drew together the results of 2 of these studies with some of the existing theoretical ideas to identify 4 dimensions of female sex addiction, including love and relationship addiction, cybersex, sex addiction, and sexual anorexia. She also pointed out that, in her view, unlike Carnes' 10 items, there were 8 that were apt for women, and these include a relationship addiction, fantasy addiction, pornography use, cybersex, masturbation addiction, exhibitionism, addicted to selling or trading sex, and one who partners with another addict. More recently, Corley and Delmonico put together something called the Women's Sexuality Survey, which gathered data from a sample of 500 women aged between 33 and 73, 90% heterosexual, 55% in committed relationships, 55% with no children, who identified as both SLA and sex addiction, compared with a self-identified non-addicted addicted group. This was conducted and carried out with the support of SASH in conjunction with the Duquesne University, which I think is in the Carolinas, is it? Yes, Johan's nodding. Okay. 67% of the addicted group reported feeling bad about their sexual behavior. 70% felt degraded. 49% reported not to be able to control sexual desire, compared with only 10% of the addicted group. 71% reported symptoms consistent with withdrawal, including irritability, anxiety, and depression. 45% reported their sexual behavior had interfered with family and personal responsibilities. And 62% made failed attempts to stop the compulsivity and the behavior. So the third group where we will find some empirical study is in the area of prediction. We know that Carnes had predicted that, or established that the biggest predictor was abuse and sexual abuse in childhood. Tedesco and Bowler, using a mixed gender sample, found this female sex addicts to report higher levels of childhood sexual abuse and severity, while Schwartz and Southern found 76% of their female clinical sample in a study of cybersex abusers to indicate a history of abuse. 52% exhibited markers of PTSD. As many as 2/3 of women in prostitution that were sampled met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and reported that the traumatic experience of physical or sexual abuse in childhood, rather than those occurring in their work as sex workers, was the original trauma. Writers speculate that this high number might reflect a woman's attempt to create an experience of being in control, unlike the experience of powerlessness experienced in the original event. Now, Opitz and colleagues, their study explored something unusual. Normally, we look at the relationship with men or women with their mothers. She looked at the relationship with daughters and their fathers. She wanted to know whether her hypothesis that the father's relationship with his daughter could in some way contribute to the development of sexual addiction. They found that fathers who were reportedly less caring, warm, and affectionate and nurturing, as well as overprotective, controlling, and intrusive, were linked to higher levels of adult female sex addiction developing. Sorry, guys. By the way, there are handouts, but they couldn't print them off. So what they're going to do is put them up on the website, and you can download them that way. Okay. Okay. So are female sex addicts different to men? I'm not going into too much detail about this because I think there are similarities which we probably all know about. I'm sure Paula in her talk this morning also went through this. So what I'm going to do is just pull out some of what sets women aside as different to men that we need to think about. Women often have a much poorer relationship with their own sexuality and identify themselves as romance addicts, believing it to be more culturally acceptable than acknowledging that they pursue purely sexual exploits. They also see themselves, this is in Corley and Delmonico's study, more as victims, the codependent, perhaps, as Castle would suggest in her work. They find it easier to believe that they couldn't say no, rather than admitting that actually there is an obsession and a compulsive purely with a sexual way of acting out. Women also struggle with power. There's a strong correlation between the female sex addicts and this issue of power. Women use sex to pursue a sense of conquest, with 54% of self-reported female sex addicts in the Women's Sexuality Survey admitting to pursuing sex with subordinates of some description. This compared with 28% of the non-addict group. These ideas challenge the more traditional view of women as the victims of male aggression and perpetration, and perhaps explain the growing number of studies showing the female addict sex offending towards children to be on the increase. Emerging trends also reflect young females, including teens and young adults, presenting for sex addiction treatment more frequently than ever before, exhibiting typically male acting out behaviors, including more overt pursuit of power through a sense of sexual conquest, which I've mentioned, and a belief that excessive sexual and multiple partners represent some sort of accolade. There are also specific risks to women that perhaps don't exist to the same degree or at all for men. These range, of course, from unwanted pregnancies, adoption traumas, STIs and STDs, AIDS, car accidents, cancers, pelvic inflammation and disease. Psychologically, the risks, of course, are depression, anxiety, paranoia, loneliness, despair, linked to guilt and shame. Often suicide or self-harm is higher amongst women than amongst men. Neglect of primary relationships, particularly of children. Spiritually, conflicts exist and are reported between a woman's value system and her behavior. 59% of the female sex addicts in the survey said their acting out interfered with their connection to their spiritual integrity, compared with 23% of the non-addicted population. Financially, they spend money on sex toys, clothes, webcams, escorts, prostitutes, embezzle from their children's piggy banks, and they may choose to do sex work as a way of sustaining their using and acting out. So employment, women don't frequently engage in internet-based sexual behaviors at work, according to Corley and Delmonico. So they don't risk losing jobs, perhaps as much as men. However, they do become involved in relationships at work, creating stalking behaviors, leading to demotions, loss of respect from colleagues, etc. Legally, they're more likely to face consequences from prostitution and sex working. They also can be arrested for acting out with exhibitionism. They're also likely to be registered as sex offenders. 7.3% of the women participating in this sexual survey admitted sexually acting out with a minor, compared with 2.2% of the non-addict population. Okay. Oh, shame. So what about shame? It's amazing, when I talk about shame, even my voice gets lower. I want to stoop down on the, it's such a heavy, visceral thing. Okay. So, Corley and Delmonico, again, I'm referring to this study, reported that 70% of women felt degraded by their sexual behavior, compared with 23% of the non-addict group. In the research that I did, one of the participants in the study talked about shame in the context of The Little Prince, which we all know. Why do you drink? Because I'm ashamed. And why are you ashamed? Because I drink. This therapist said the cycle repeats itself in sex addiction, but he added that he had a female client who was a sex worker who committed suicide, and in one of their last sessions she used to say to him, "Shame for me and my sex addiction is what oxygen is to a fire." So the last bit, and perhaps the most important for the talk this afternoon, is this notion of this relational component. Talks about it a lot, and I'm not sure that there was sufficient written about it when I was looking. And, okay. For women, the most important difference is this, the relational component in their acting out. And this is the central feature of the engine that fuels the disease of sex addiction for women and sets them apart from men, perhaps. So let's begin to tie more of the pieces together in the story. Let's just think about why women are more drawn towards connection, perhaps, and to seeking out experiences of some sort of imagined or real better quality in their relationships. In her groundbreaking work on normal female development in a different voice, Carol Gilligan describes how women create a sense of identity through relationships, through the development of an ego in context way of relating. Unlike male developmental theorists from Freud to Erikson, who have emphasized the need for human beings to become autonomous, Gilligan is suggesting that normal female development actually involves an early need for the opposite: intimacy skills, the capacity to be close, and to sustain a psychological closeness with another. She says that actually this starts to shift again when women get into their 30s and 40s, maybe their 50s, and that they then begin to seek a more autonomous way of living. Men, on the other hand, are more encouraged to find this in their identity first and explore their intimacy skills later. The point here is that a woman's need to understand herself in the context of relationship is not, by definition, pathological. I mean, how often are we talking with clients who are ashamed of the fact that they're needy or that they are looking for a reassurance or they're looking... So Gilligan is saying, we need to put this aside because a woman's need to understand herself in the context of relationship is not, by definition, pathological. It's only when these normal developmental needs are distorted, usually through early abuse experience, that desperate, compulsive, and obsessive behaviors emerge, culminating in various scenarios of women who love too much and sexual compulsivity. Certainly what seems to set a sex addiction apart from other addictions and makes it so persistent is that the subject of sex touches on our most innermost, I'm going to try that one more time, on our innermost selves, and as such is a symbolic enactment of deeply entrenched, unconscious and maladaptive relational patterns with self and other. These involve deficits and disruptions to these early developmental inter- and intra-psychic processes. So, are we actually talking here about sex addiction in terms of attachment theory and affect regulation? And if so, are we thinking of female sex addiction in terms of an attachment failure? Okay, so the curiosity here is sex addiction shaped in part by a person's experience of early attachment failure? And does this open up an understanding of this relational component that's talked about as a central organizing feature of female sex addiction in this way? So Shaver et al.'s study of attachment and relationship quality argue that romantic love involves three component systems, including attachment, caregiving, and sexuality, with the relative importance of these systems following a predictable pattern over lifetime. They see the attachment system as being the earliest to form, and therefore the working models that develop from this basis at this stage influence the expression of caregiving and, most importantly, the developing sexual patterns. Hence, the attachment system is viewed as being pivotal to the establishment and maintenance of romantic and sexual behaviors in adulthood. Importantly, the authors discuss the possibility that attachment orientations are associated with different sex-related strategies and goals within romantic relationships. These ideas are built on Bowlby's view that attachment and sexual patterns are embedded in discrete and yet reciprocal systems that interplay with the internal working model to shape interpersonal and sexual behaviors. Buzz and Kenrick originally conceptualized these as sexual working models and said they were psychic structures which organize erotic sexual representations, in addition to the internal working models of self and other. Leeds estimates that 95% of sex addicts are unable to form close attachments. Dufar found no significant difference in attachment styles between men and women, but her study did show sex addicts to be 60% less likely than non-addicted men and women to relate to their partners in a securely attached way. Hassan and colleagues, as far back as 1994, conducted a study using a sample of 100 heterosexual and gay men and women, and they showed a positive association between sexual compulsivity and anxious and avoidant attachment styles in all participants. These findings seem to suggest that high rates of sexual compulsivity are associated with difficulty in forming secure attachments in adult life. They found three distinct styles, but the most significant perhaps for today being that ambivalently attached females tended to engage in compulsivity involving exhibitionism, voyeurism, domination, and bondage. Interestingly, results indicated that sexually addicted males and females exhibit characteristics of a more fearful avoidant style of attachment. Okay, so I just want to talk very briefly about disorganized attachment and sexuality. Jeremy Holmes makes reference to the severe attachment disorganization and how this creates sexually orientated characteristics. These he describes as dissociative responses to stress, which can be seen as attempts to create some sort of coherent strategy for self-soothing. In his view, these regulating strategies involve high risk, shame-inducing, debased, and unpleasurable sexual behaviors, which are understood as follows: that the individual is resorting to a dominant submission rather than a mutuality. A routine is preferred to the sense of total chaos. Bringing together sex and aggression means the sufferer's pain is an escape, is a way of escaping dissociation. Having a defined role, he says, even as a victim, is preferable to a non-identity and brings some sense of protection, even if it's at the expense of pleasure or self-respect. He says the shame of vulnerable neediness is enacted through degrading sex in repetitive ways that gives the subject an illusion of mastery. Okay. So let's look a little closer at attachment. The energy in the room should lift now. Okay.
Sorry.
So, how many people in the room were at the talk last year? Oh, that's a relief. Okay, because the slides, I'm repeating some of the slides.
Lucky you.
Lucky me. Okay, so, early attachment studies. Over the last decade, what has become abundantly clear is that critical periods of early brain development in health and disease are likely to be one of the most important discoveries in all of science, with major implications in our field. While many studies demonstrate early attachment history to shape factors of personality, adult relationship dynamics, and sexual patterns, for us this afternoon, perhaps of more use is the contemporary view that the primary function of the attachment system is one of affect regulation. Modern attachment theory sees the capacity of the mother-infant dyad to manage emotional experience together in the first years of life, and this as being central to adult mental health and the development of psychopathology. Just about every psychiatric disorder shows some problem with affect dysregulation, and addiction is no different. So what we know is that it is the quality of the mother's subjective availability to her infant that is probably the most significant factor of the infant's early growing experience. While the infant is born pre-wired to seek connection to the mother must be subjectively perceived and experienced by the infant as being predictable, consistent, and emotionally available. Okay, I'm going to try and put the video on, so bear with me. need volume. What we're watching is how the mother is attuning to the baby. She is exaggerating the positive expression on her face. She is engaging in eye contact. She is following where his finger or her finger is pointing. So we're looking at how the mother attunes to the baby and how they communicate. This early regulation is about responding to the baby's feelings and arousal in a non-verbal way. And in a very non-verbal way, because we don't have the sound. No? No. We're missing a lot of cooing and eyeing and... Okay. So the mother is joining the baby in her positive feelings by matching or using her mirroring tone of voice, excited facial expression, matching this with the baby's body gesture. She's moving forward, she's pointing. She basically enters the inner state of the baby's world and tells her that she knows what it's like to be her, and that there is somebody to co-regulate her feelings in this cross-modal language. By all sorts of non-verbal means, the mother will get the baby back to his set points within his comfortable parameters of feeling, where he or she will feel comfortable again. What was really interesting that Tronick pointed out, or it might have been Trevarthen, which we might see in a minute, is that the baby in these communications is actually a third of a second ahead of the mother. So all the mothers in the room who think that you are leading, you're not. Your baby is leading, but it's so fast that you don't see it. Okay? So when parents track the baby's feeling states and respond in predictable ways, patterns will start to be established. For instance, the baby may be noticing, when I cry, Mum always picks me up gently, or when she gets her coat down, I'll soon smell the fresh air. This process has been described by various writers in different ways, and whichever theory we subscribe to, we know that patterns are laid down in unconscious procedural memory, and based on the baby's learned experience of what happens with mother, will re-emerge later on as a person's sense of self and other in his wider world, her wider world. These ideas speak, I think, in most of the theories that we know, whether it's Jung's schema therapy, the internal working models that are Bowlby's, or Daniel Stern's Riggs. Children who grow up with the most crucial assumption that others will be emotionally available to help process, notice feelings, and provide comfort, in other words, co-regulate, are regarded as securely attached. I'm not going to do this because time is ticking, but I would look on YouTube at Trevarthen. Are you about to put it on? No, that's fine, don't worry. Okay. Okay. There is a second part to the still face experiment, which I will describe because I'm not going to try and engage in all the buttons. And what it shows is what happens when the mother removes her gaze from the baby, and within a second the baby becomes disoriented, distressed, cries, makes a lot of noise, starts kicking his legs and feet around, and is clearly experiencing levels of distress that the mother finds hard to sit and watch. As soon as she re-engages, the baby then starts to down-regulate, and they return to that homeostatic balance. What the mother is doing is placing within the procedural memory of the child or the infant a template to which he or she will refer unconsciously for the rest of life. I say rest of life, it's revisable and changeable, but that's the idea. Okay, if it wasn't, we might not be doing what we do. Okay, so by all sorts of non-verbal means, mother will get the baby through visio-facial, audio prosodic, and tactile gestural. and she will get her to return to the set points where she will feel comfortable. These proto-conversations are also part of what we as therapists are busy with all the time with our clients. The central function for the mother is that the secure attachment figure particularly heightens the infant's experience of positive affect, downregulates the infant's negative states like anger, fear, and anxiety. This, I remember talking about last year, is a shift from what people in the field earlier thought was happening. They thought the attachment system was involved only in the downregulation of the infant's negative states. But actually what happens is, more importantly, the mother is involved in helping the child experience a heightened positive affect, which is more crucial for neurological development. This also supports the infant's capacity to experience an affect array and a vitality affect. These are Shore and Daniel Stern's terms. In other words, the child acquires the capacity to experience a wide range of feelings with an increased tolerance for negative and positive emotions, and these as being a lived body experience that is indivisibly connected with the mother, other, and her world. Okay. So what goes wrong? The baby cannot learn to monitor and adjust his or her own feeling states effectively. And if mum or dad can't or won't do this for her in the first place, then there's trouble. If mum doesn't have a comfortable relationship with her own feelings, in that they may be blocked off, avoidant, or she may be flooded and preoccupied by them too easily, then she's going to find it very hard to be aware or attuned to her baby's feelings. And she may not be able to regulate them at all. Chances are, if parents cannot regulate their own regulatory problems internally, then they're going to pass this on to their infants, who may be left without any clear sense of how to keep an eye on an even emotional keel. Hardwiring is then linked to the capacity to manage stress. Okay. I'm just going to whiz through this. Yeah, I am going to whiz through this. Okay. So what happens then is that we develop a variety of dysregulation, styles of dysregulation, consistent with the attachment experience and the attachment style that we develop. The avoidant parents who cannot tolerate their baby's distress without becoming anxious themselves leave the baby on their own with intense feelings that don't or can't go away. The child is learning that there is no regulatory help with these feelings, and so learns to hold them back, to deny them, avoid them, doesn't express them, as they're going to upset mum. Attachment research shows these children to appear calm and unconcerned, but when the heart rate and autonomic nervous system was measured, it was rocketing. As adults, these people will automatically slam on the brakes when strong feelings start to rise, so they don't have to be aware of feelings that they don't know what to do with. These avoidant working models predispose a person toward a proneness to automatically downregulate hyperaroused feelings. The parasympathetic arousal dominates as a default and is triggered as a response to stress. This results in a person minimizing emotion, dismissing attachment needs, and results in a person's over-reliance on auto-regulation, which is often the only place of refuge. Dan Hill says the stage is set here for a subclinical shame-permeated depression and an over-regulated experience of anger, fear, joy, and pride, often seen in more schizoid personality presentations. Ambivalent parents with a more consistent and volatile way of responding to their child's feelings are initially able to attune to the baby and offer connection, but they cannot sustain it. And as soon as they begin to feel anxious or uncomfortable, they withdraw from connection. The baby in that moment is left with her feelings close to the surface, bubbling away. They don't repress their feelings, but rather they learn to exaggerate them, becoming overly aware of their fears and needs until they can make a bid for their parents' attention when they think there's a chance of getting it. So the baby is being used to regulate the feelings of the parents and is actually left alone with her own emotions. What follows is the inability of the parent to repair this misattunement, This undermines the baby's stretch for independence and results in an over-reliance on dyadic regulation. As adults, this results in under-regulated sympathetic arousal or hyper-aroused responses to stress. Their capacity for auto-regulation is deficient, and they are much more likely to plunge headlong into expressing feelings without restraint and without regard for others. They are hypersensitive to experiences, real or imagined, of abandonment, and are hypervigilant and hyperactive to stress. The children caught up in either of these insecure regulation patterns will have a much weaker sense of self than the securely attached child, and will either try to protect their shaky sense of self by withdrawing from others when they feel uncertain, or alternatively, by clinging on to others to try and elicit more feedback and more regulation. So the disorganized parents. Very often when parents themselves have been overwhelmed by trauma and have not processed the material, they are unable to provide the most basic parenting functions, resulting in neglect or abuse. These children become uncertain and afraid about how to manage feelings when under pressure or psychic stress, and they just don't know whether to turn to mother or keep away from her. The baby needs her, but she may make things worse rather than better. As adults, these children may swing between a pattern of slamming on the brakes and expressing feelings without restraint. They have chaotic relationships, cannot calm themselves or cope with distress. They cannot manage emotional regulation in any consistent way. Small stress escalates into major distress, and they may find it difficult to hold back feelings at all. Internally, these people are unable to trust their own emotions and responses, and are constantly looking for cues in others about how to act and how to feel. These adapted styles are the best that these clever little people can do to seek as much emotional homeostasis as possible in the absence of a good enough co-regulating experience with mother or other. They will often seek external regulation in the form of excessive risk-taking, self-harm, eating disorders, substance use, and sexual compulsivity, often expressed as features of some personality disorders, mood disorders, and PTSD. Okay, so in this experience of dysregulation is this word stress, which I referred to in the last talk. So stress reactivity and stress intolerance are big things in the literature as these areas dovetail together. Secure attachments are associated with increased resilience in the face of stress, accompanied by less reactive reward responding, i.e. an increased resilience against drug addiction. Volkow also comments that stress reactivity results in increased cravings for alcohol and other drugs and leads to repeated relapse. Don't quite know why this is here, other than I get to play with the dots. Okay, so the disease model, I'm not going to explain this, but it links to what we're talking about. What the disease model emphasizes is this role of stress and an addict's inability to modulate or regulate it. So what I think this stress refers to is nothing more than affect dysregulation. And what I believe underpins affect dysregulation is relationship. I'm not arguing the case that this idea replaces anything we know already, but what I am suggesting is that as clinicians, we probably need to think about this sort of thing more at the forefront of our clinical awareness. Okay. So, stress, disease, vulnerability, and addiction. Becker and colleagues in 2007 hypothesized that women are more vulnerable than males to developing disease, mood disorder, and addiction, and she attributes this to their greater neuropsychological vulnerability to their emotional stress. Reid studies have certainly shown that individuals who manifest symptoms of hypersexual behavior are more likely to experience deficits in affect regulation and have greater levels of emotional instability and stress vulnerability. Although the studies up to this point did not account for any gender difference, Reid and Dufar explored predictive factors of female hypersexuality, with findings demonstrating that despite high levels of emotional dysregulation, including stress vulnerability and interpersonal sensitivity, this was similar for both men and women. She didn't find a difference. Having said that, Reid concluded clearly in his study that stress vulnerability, although generalized and a perpetuating risk factor for sexual addiction that men and women share, he also noted there were some interesting variations between genders. Women reported having a much higher measure of excitement seeking than men and exhibited greater difficulty trusting others and processing emotions, particularly anger and resentment. Get that? Of particular relevance in light of Becker's article was that 61% of the hypersexual women in the sample, compared with 32% of men, indicated they had difficulty coping with stress. Reid concluded by reporting that, or by suggesting that treatment approaches for hypersexual women must centralize affect regulating interventions and strategies for coping with stress, as well as an approach accounting for interpersonal sensitivity. So he's reflecting that any therapeutic endeavor treating sexually addicted women must cultivate an experience of relational security through which they can address issues of personal trust, interpersonal trust, self-confidence, and affect regulation, and that this must particularly address the experience and expression of suppressed and unformulated feelings. Okay. So, I mean, this idea that affect regulation is a therapeutic method is something that we have seen in some but not many clinical research studies. There was one into binge eating disorder, episodic bulimia, deliberate self-harm, PTSD. These, I think, were homogeneous female samples, and I think it's the University of New York in Buffalo also looked at the role of affect in the change mechanism in alcohol addiction and the effects of negative affect on treatment outcomes. So research looked at interventions for women presenting with psychological and psychiatric conditions that particularly involved symptoms of repetitive and compulsive behaviors. We know this to manage the unbearable consequences of this disequilibrium of affect, and that these studies highlighted the efficacy of these regulatory-orientated interventions. So while measures of clients' difficulty managing affect are highest for females presenting in therapy with post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder, this has not been replicated in the addiction field. It's not difficult, though, to speculate about the importance of affect regulation as a central therapeutic intervention in therapy for female sex addicts, given the reported likelihood of comorbidity with these other diagnoses. Okay. So, Alex Katahakis, a CSAT in LA, part of Alan Shore's monthly study group at the Geffen Medical Center at UCLA, wrote a paper in 2009 called Affective Neuroscience, and she placed this in the Journal for Sexual Compulsivity. She positioned affect dysregulation as the central causal factor underpinning sex addiction, and where her work becomes really contemporary is in highlighting the imperative for sex addiction treatment to include attention to the mutually coordinated and co-regulated right hemisphere to right hemisphere mechanisms of connection and regulation. She sees it as essential that any approach to the therapeutic treatment of sex and sex addicts involves repair to these early implicit regulatory dynamics. So Katahakis is proposing treatment, addiction, and therapy in the context of an interpersonal, two-person psychology, a self and self with other organization, rather than the intrapsychic self and self-object organization of Kohut, Kantian, and Goodman. So based on what I've talked about already, what we know is that the research in the field of infant studies has changed the shape of adult treatment. A shift in the field of psychotherapy from its emphasis on models of cognitive development to the significance of affect in the intersubjective context. And as such, we are seeing therapy as being redefined as an affect communicating cure rather than a talking cure. What has emerged over the last decade is the role of affect as a therapeutic method and a key factor in the therapeutic action of change for a number of psychological conditions. This is considered in the context of the relational processes between therapist and client, and in particular as being embedded in the implicit relational ways of being with that both parties bring to the therapeutic process. So where do these ideas of affect dysregulation dovetail into clinical practice? Okay. What they're suggesting is that this two-person, not one-person, relational psychology involves different processes. It's not about the therapist doing something to the client or for the client, maybe, but more about the doing with in the co-constructed and co-determined relationship that they do together. We see processes of relationship as a central factor of therapeutic repair, change, and regulation, and this as moving the client into a secure earned attachment experience with us in the work. This is a relational process rooted in what the therapist and the client do together, and as such is requiring the therapist to engage at such a level and with such a pull on their innermost selves in the context of their own socio-political, cultural attachments, early histories, traumas, and a vulnerability to their own processes of dissociation. Okay. So, I think what's important to talk about at this point is that what I'm talking about today doesn't in any way challenge or exclude any of the other approaches or models that we're all familiar with. But what I'm suggesting is that this is something that we hold both in the foreground and in the background, because it informs the relationship that we establish with our clients. Director and Burton have argued fervently. So Director and Burton have argued fervently that the emphasis on working with the implicit processes and enactments advocated by relational theorists is ideally suited to working with addicted clients. I think what we have to assume is that when you're working in this way with your clients, most of the work, I think, is at a non-verbal, implicit level. What they are talking about are shifts in these unconscious implicit patterns that are laid down in the first 2 years of life. Okay, Burton understands the addicted client as struggling to integrate multiple affect-laden self-states and suggests that these important pockets of the client's dissociated and split-off experience are often missed in treatment, unless they are effectively worked with in therapy. While Burton's relational perspective sees enactment as being unavoidable in the therapeutic work, Director echoes Gerson and Lyons-Ruth, seeing enactments as inevitably holding promise as a means by which the addict may reproduce an unresolved relational dynamic in therapeutic form. This affords the opportunity of awareness, knowledge, and change. Director suggests that both in the theory and the approach, the relational model provides the basis for the desired course of treatment for addiction, and argues that it is by placing enactment at the heart of this analytic work that relational practitioners can open the door of a deeper experience of therapy to their addicted clients. So in my view, this is particularly well placed in the work with female sex addiction, given what we've explored in the context of this relational component that we talked about earlier. We talked about this shaping a woman's, being shaped by a woman's early attachment disruption and the catastrophic derailment to her affect regulating system, leading in several ways, through several pathways, to sexual compulsivity and addiction. Okay, so implications for us as therapists. The usefulness for practice of all of this is rooted, I think, in the value of how we think about ourselves as therapists. Are we willing to get involved and engage in the muck and the mess of what this work entails at this level? It involves exploring at depth our own social and political views, our own beliefs around gender, our own beliefs around sex, our own experiences and traumas of sex. It also asks that we look at how we regulate and relate to our own affect. How do we deal with our own feelings? Are we a little too shut down? Are we a little avoidant? Are we clingy and preoccupied? How do we know ourselves in this way? This has implications for training too. The capacity to work with skill at levels of this implicit unconscious material, often inside complex and challenging pockets, involving enactments and dissociative processes, both the client's and yours. We need to have comfort in our own skin with this and a capacity for self-awareness and self-reflexivity. In this work, we also need to have been in good and long-term therapy, in my belief. We also need to be aware of our own vulnerability as therapists and pay a lot of attention to our self-care in good supervision. We need to think about training. We need to find one that has a good personal therapy component. We need to make sure we're insured. We need to make sure our notes are clear and appropriate. We also need to I've written self-care 3 times, again. Maybe it's something I need to listen to. Self-care is very important. You are going to end up carrying, holding, metabolizing, chewing, being constipated by your client's unconscious traumas. You are going to be carrying what they cannot carry for themselves until they can. So self-care, and more self-care. All of the above contribute to and support your availability as the therapist to your female sex addict client, and in a very particular and important way. So it is the quality of this relationship that you bring to the work that can offer the client let me just go back a bit actually. Another bit I also wanted to add was I think there's something to be said for assessing honestly your suitability for this work with each client that you work with. And that is not the suitability to start the work, it's also imagining what the work is going to be like and how it is going to unfold perhaps. And when I take on a new client, I often think about, is the client right? Sometimes I don't, If I'm financially worried, I just say yes, but it is important to think about your suitability to the client who is being assessed. And I think it is in general, but I think particularly with this client group. So these clients in this work rely on the responsiveness of you, of the therapist. It's the quality of the relationship that is inextricably bound to the therapist's capacity to be available to the client in the very deepest depths of their disturbance. The idea that work relies on the receptivity of the therapist means that the client is not left alone, and that by this there is inevitably a far greater demand. See, I'm getting tired, I'm losing my words here. There is a greater demand on your capacity for tolerance, particularly working at depth with deep affective relational disequilibrium and disturbance. What this demands of you as the therapist is both a capacity for a conceptualization of thinking, as well as a capacity to convey to the client an empathic and non-judgmental availability and quality of relationship. I think the greater contribution here lies perhaps in us contemplating the fallacy of therapeutic objectivity and neutrality, and instead adhere to Rennick's assertion that the emotionally responsive therapist is always irreducibly subjective. All right, my hope is that the presentation not only highlighted the importance of the use of the subjectivity and responsiveness of the therapist to the client in this work, but that it also shows that a relational approach centralizing affect regulation is a workable therapeutic approach and has a place in addiction work. As such, okay, the next slide. Okay, so to conclude, while female sex addiction clearly represents a contentious and narrow area of addiction and psychological therapy, it also clearly emerges as a condition rooted in persistent and dysregulated affect, positioning it well within an attachment framework and a relational psychology. So the talk this afternoon has aimed on the one hand to position female sex addiction as a clinical concern, highlighting the need for a gender-sensitive consideration on the one hand, and on the other to continuously locate it within a paradigm of relational psychology. This sees affect regulation as a key central therapeutic method, and this as being born directly from ideas of attachment that currently inform our clinical thinking. It has set out to explore some of the processes involved between therapist and female sex addict, and not to adhere too closely to classifications of symptoms due to the time and space limitation. This work, in this way, is challenging and demanding, and as such brings experience of rich complexity which is found within the layers of the lived experience in the relational encounter with our clients in this group. Okay. Thank you. Anybody have any questions, or would you like to rush for some tea? Tea? Oh, hi. Sorry, Mark.
I am a gay man, and I'm in recovery for sex addiction and stuff, and I'm a journalist. I wrote a book about the gay experience, and I find a lot of resistance to the concept of sex addiction because culturally gay men have kind of just celebrated all of this. And I just wondered, do you find that? Do you get criticism, this idea that, talking about it is a way of kind of repressing women? Is that something, because it's a big thing that I see online, it seems like it's more controversial by the week to talk about it.
Do you mean female sex addiction?
Sex addiction in particular. I think men are allowed, sometimes it's kind of straight men are allowed, people are comfortable with that, but with gay men or women, people seem to think it's a way of kind of repressing people.
I mean, there's a lot of literature out there discussing exactly that. I mean, it's hard to find because when you Google it, what comes up is really not what you'd want to find, I don't think. I think yes is the answer. I think this is such an interesting debate that also would be a sort of presentation on its own. But I think, there is an argument from this socio-cultural perspective that actually what we are doing is constructing something that isn't there. And I guess with other peripheral groups, the same is true. I think there is an argument for sexual addiction amongst women, but I think we have to be very cautious about our assessment and our thinking about this. I also think that what is fascinating, and when I did my research, which was very interesting, was that therapists I interviewed were unaware of some of the constructs that they held themselves, and were quite shocked when we started to unpick and explore that a little bit. And I think it starts with the individual. I think this is something of our political responsibility, our social responsibility as clinicians, to really begin to look at actually what we sit with. Because it won't be just ours, we will be carrying for the wider field as well. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting contention. And I think there are arguments for both, and there is something of just being able to sit with the nuance of what's there. Probably a blank canvas with each client we sit with as well, I would think. Did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, really interesting.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Hi. That kind of leads into what I was going to ask. I've got a very young client who is rather promiscuous and has been sent by her mother to see me. And I definitely, this is all spot on for her really, but she's in a complete denial, and it's how we approach this with the client, because she's come to me with a history of trauma and abuse, so it's all there. But she's highly defended, highly. She's a psychology student as well, which is wonderful. And she just said to me one day, she said, I just like sex, Charlotte, what's wrong with that? Like, I'm being crude. So I'm trying to work out how I'm actually building, like you say here, I'm working on our relationship at the moment. That's the core stuff. She doesn't trust me. So we're only on session 4. But I'm just interested how you broach this stuff, because it's especially the younger generation, where women are, this is kind of a cool thing to do. She's like, she's had 50 partners in 1 year, the young lady. It's a lot, I'm quite concerned about her self-respect level, but without doing it, like you say, without all the, like you said, the internal judgment and it coming across like you're being mum.
It's interesting because I know Paula Hall, who's around somewhere, I think she talks in her book of working with females. I don't know at what age, but she says that in her experience, working with trauma with women for her was more effective than actually working with the sexual compulsivity directly. I mean, that may be helpful. And an experience of some sort of regulating relationship with you. But it's difficult, yeah. But I think this is where it also, some of the applicability of the male model too. There's something of trying to arrest the behavior and at the same time balance the rapport that you're building at the same time. And of course, the more you try and do that, the more the weightiness of the material crashes into the space with you as the therapist. And sometimes there's a temptation to keep it outside. So I think that's interesting to think about, perhaps, too. Is that okay?
Thank you.
All right. I have to go to Josh first.
Okay. Thanks, Fiona. That was great. In your research, did you find any implications of the gender of the therapist in this work? Making it, yeah.
I should have brought a whole other stack of it.
Yeah,
I did actually.
But in terms of just like anything sort of general, did you notice significant implications?
Do you know what springs to mind actually was, I want to say male therapist's anxiety. And the anxiety was around this sort of out of control sense of, oh shit, it was what do we do with this? And it wasn't even so much of the vulnerability because of the erotic and things like this, although that did come up. It was a sort of an anxiety about how do I manage this? How do I manage this woman in the room who might just lose her shit in a minute? It was something like this, and they would very much couch some of their interventions because of this. They raised also nervousness about court cases. They didn't want to be experienced as being prurient, and what it meant was that they sort of couched a lot of their interventions and were a little less ready to take risks in the work. And those were the more conscious things. I think unconsciously, there was one participant who was a bit of an outlier who clearly had some interesting prejudices and sort of biases going on that were completely in his blind spot, which is a little scary. I think most therapists are pretty aware, but it was the holding back. It compromised some of what they might have been able to do. So the gender piece is huge, I think. Yeah.
cultural.
And the
Cultural.
cultural, yeah.
Being French, I feel that I've got a very different relationship to sex than
Yeah.
English people seem to
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
So that would play a role in the room.
That's interesting too, as well. I've not thought of this. Of course there would be. Yeah. Yeah. Johan.
It's going back towards the earlier thing, the kind of different types of presentations that are set up with a traditional male sexual acting out in sex fiction versus film. It'd be really interesting to see how you separate out some of those things and what it looks like. And missing the female sexual compulsivity, which is kind of masked in dysfunctional attachment styles. So I see, I guess you see a lot more than with male sexual acting, which can often be much more blatant. Hard to find material on it.
Hard to find material. Impossible.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
I mean,
I'm not
seriously.
just looking.
No. I mean, impossible. Marnie Free
Yeah.
and Alex Kafahakis and there's somebody else, is it Kelly McDaniel? There are a few writers around. What can I say? They're not academics.
Okay, but our language is so clumsy
Yeah.
that it's understandable that clients are confused because our categorization is so unclear, our language is so clumsy
Yeah.
that it's quite hard to actually sketch out any diagnostic pathway
Yeah.
until someone, does something about it.
Yeah, and then you get into that territory of so where do we draw the line between attending too much to semantics and vocabulary and symptomology, and not enough then to what's happening and who the client is and what they're bringing. And so yeah, there is that balance, but there is nothing really out there that I think supports our thinking about women. In this context, other than what's there for men, and actually, I don't think it's helpful. It could be more helpful. There could be more.
It's just part of life.
Yeah.
And how it's laid out.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that too is because I think women in general are not absolutely clear about what it means for them either.
Yeah.
So I think that's another piece. Anybody else? Tea for sure this time. All right. Thank you.